Hello, this is our third class. We have already talked about what we're teaching, about the subject matter of ELT. You should remember about knowledge and skills. We also talked about our learners and whom we teach. And now we'll talk about the learning series or hypotheses, and we'll discuss how they may be valuable for us as teachers. So we'll talk about important learning series in relation to the second language acquisition mechanisms theory by Stephen Krashen. We'll talk about the affective filter, comprehensible input, zone of proximal development, cone of learning, thinking skills, 4 stages of learning, and spiral curriculum. They all are very important for you as a teacher. And why? I hope you will be able to answer this question by the end of this session. So once again, here are the series or hypotheses, which is like, you know, that in teaching, there is no theory that would be proved because every case is unique. So we're talking about hypotheses. Let's start with the very basic one about the SLA Mechanisms Theory. Second language acquisition means that we don't learn a language, we acquire it. And you already can tell that it's true because we understand that we don't know about the language, we get the skill. So, 2 important people here, Stephen Krashen and Meryl Swain, they talked about such scheme of acquiring a language. Input, or the language that a teacher gives to a student, or maybe the student gets this language from other sources. But now we're talking about our learning and our teaching. The student notices this language, and here where the intake happens. Intake means that we start acquiring this language. We start possessing it, like we eat it. And from this is where the language acquisition happens. And finally, through processing, through storing the language in long-term memory, we come to the output stage. And here, in the output stage, it's what our learners are able to put out. So what language they can produce, and what language they can convey precisely, coherently, and appropriately. So input, intake, processing, and then output, what we can get out. So it's a wonderful scheme, and it looks very much as a computer. However, like you put information in the computer, it processes it, and then it gives you the output. However, students are not computers. So very often our input, which we'll talk about comprehensible input later, but our input can be hampered by the filter, by this affective filter that can hamper our intake. What are the factors that raise the affective filter, or what are the factors that lower it? Factors that raise it are negative factors. They are like lack of motivation, depression, even when students are not comfortable or when they are sick. There are so many courses which raise the filter and block our learners from understanding, from acquiring the material. However, positive factors such as teachers' enthusiasm, comfortable environment, good group can facilitate language intake and lower bit blocks. Also, if we compare this part to the previous part, we'll see that input can be comprehensible, or we're talking about I+1. Comprehensible input, again, this is the theory by Stephen Krashen, tells us that the students are able to acquire new language when the instruction and the material are just beyond the student's current level of proficiency, meaning that everything should be just a bit difficult, not really difficult, and not too easy. So it brings us to the idea of comprehensible input. The students have to understand it, to comprehend it, and to be able to process it. And now our scheme already looks like this. Input has to be comprehensible and to be acquired by a learner. It should overcome this affective filter, or the filter has to be really, really low. So how can we help in it, and why the spiral curriculum idea is so important here? You were acquainted with this idea in the course about teaching new generation, and the spiral curriculum, another name for it is sticky curriculum. It is for sticking in our students' brain, and usually it allows us to introduce very difficult topics at early stages with very simple words, and then due to the spiral curriculum come back to this idea again, and that is how by a certain level the students will not only deepen the knowledge, but this knowledge will stick into their brains. My favorite example here is that in interclass, our students learn about gerund very early, like reading, speaking, answers the question what and doing what, and only much later they learn that it is gerund. So next we see that we have input, which is comprehensible. We have spiral curriculum. It tells us what kind of input we should give. We see the filter that hampers our students. And now we are at the stage of language acquisition, how the language is acquired. And here another theory is the hypothesis of learning flow. It means that your learners learn much better when the material that you give them is considers the zone of proximal development. This theory was developed by Lev Vygotsky, and he said that ZPD, or zone of proximal development, is what a learner can do without assistant and what a learner can do with some assistance. It means that it is very close. In my brain, it is very close to comprehensible input. It's structural your material so that it was a bit difficult, and learners were able to process it in cooperation with their peers. So by now we already have input, spiral curriculum, affective filter, and zone of proximal development. And another important theory here is about deep learning and surface learning. It is very important in terms of learners' motivation. When we talk about surface learning, which is actually only learning as reproduction, only focusing on unrelated details, and memorization is the main focus of it. So it's surface learning. And it is usually opposed by deep learning, which is when your students set real goals, they seek understanding, they relate previous knowledge to the knowledge they get, they use reflection, and altogether it brings them to understanding. So this deep and surface learning are the theories that help us understand why students learn, what is their motivation. So when they are at a surface level, they will just remember by heart, retell, and forget. But at a deep level learn. So they will learn it and they will try to retain it because they are responsible for this knowledge. This theory is very closely connected with Edgar Dale's cone of learning, and it already tells us what we need to do at a lesson, what our students need to do at a lesson. So it shows us that if you just read, hear, see, but you don't actually do anything, you are at the stage of passive learning, or we can say that you are at the stage of surface learning, and you are able to describe, explain, and demonstrate, but you are not able to go higher. You go higher when you start learning actively. And then you're able to analyze, define, create, evaluate, and it all happens only because you are deeply involved into the learning. Your learning is active and your learning is deep. And that is how, you'll see this model closer, that is how you actively learn when you say, write, and do, and you learn passively when you just accept the knowledge. Here there is also the connection between listening and reading, which are receptive skills, and writing and speaking, which are productive skills. So again, skills, we need to practice them. And by now, we already, like, our map keeps growing. You know that IntiClass is based on maps, IntiClass is based on schemes, and that is how we teach teachers as well. And so look what we have now. We are adding Bloom's taxonomy. Only this Bloom's taxonomy, I put a sign here that it correlates like this way. And at the very bottom of Bloom's taxonomy is remembering, understanding. Then you apply the facts, then you analyze, evaluate, and create. That is how we go from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. And that it tells us how we need to structure our learning. If we want our students to go through passive learning, it is a teacher-centered classroom. You just tell them and they do. And they are not able to remember much. They learn passively and they don't form higher order thinking skills. However, if they learn actively, if they participate, if they are responsible for their learning, they learn higher order thinking skills, and they develop as 21st century learners. So now to this schema, we'll add my favorite hypothesis. It is about the 4 phases of learning. It is very close to the spiral curriculum, and it tells us about the 4 phases or phases of learning. It is how we remember. It says that we don't remember anything at the very beginning, or we can't remember, we can't stick this knowledge into our brains with simple memorization only. We need to go through the phases of impressing, memorizing, authorization, and initiation. We have the whole video about this, and this video was in the previous course. The idea is that we need a map or a scheme first, then through the tasks and exercises, we process this map or scheme or just a bulk of knowledge, a category. Then some details, our brain will get rid of them at the authorization stage, and only finally the students will learn it. So again, go back to the previous video, and if you don't remember what it was about. So finally, we have this rather complicated schema that shows us all hypotheses of teaching and learning. Once again, we prepare material, and we prepare this language material to be comprehensible. We think of the comprehensible input, and we also remember about the spiral curriculum. We don't give all knowledge at once. We try not to give lots of grammar rules, because we remember that our students won't remember them. We don't give lots of words at once, because again, they won't remember it. But we understand that with years, they will be remembering more and more. So then when we come to the classroom, we are always aware of affective filter. It means that no matter how hard we try, our students will never be learning well if they are not comfortable, if you are not enthusiastic, and if the learning environment is not what they expect. Then you start your class, and or you start your academic year, or you start learning a unit, and you always remember about the flow, the zone of proximal development. That is how you structure your lesson, and that is how you involve your students into the learning process. When you structure the process, you always remember about the 4 phases of learning, and it is very close to the spiral curriculum, and it tells us that there is no need to ask our students learn anything by heart. Instead, using this constant using the spirals, using different activities to go back to the vocabulary, we'll be able to teach our students the whole picture if only we remember about the 4 phases of learning. So it shows us what to do with the material, structure it, make it quite difficult and quite simple as well, and go back to it many times. And at your class, you remember about the shift from shallow and passive learning into deep and active learning. It may only happen when your students not only read, hear, and see, which is shallow and passive learning, but also only when they are actively involved into learning. And for this, you go by Bloom's taxonomy, you develop lower order thinking skills, but you also develop the higher order thinking skills. And that is how your output grows, because your students remember more, and what is more important, their language skills grow. So that was our basic scheme for today. By now, we have already talked about learners and their characteristics. We talked about different hypotheses of learning. And in the next video, we'll talk about motivation, what a teacher should do to increase our language learning, to increase the involvement of our students, and how is it possible to do it with all this series of hypotheses, and what we should do. So thank you for your attention, and see you in the next session.